Bismillah. Hello and Yali Madad. My name is Dr. Naaila Hudani, and I will be the moderator for today's Critical Conversation. The Critical Conversation series has been conceived as an ITREB USA initiative aimed at engaging the entire Jamaat, but with a focus on 18 to 40-year-olds. The series aims to explore the critical questions of our time within the context of our faith. Before we begin, I would like to read a land acknowledgement. Land acknowledgements are formal statements that seek to recognize and respect Indigenous peoples as original stewards of their land and the enduring relationship that exists between Indigenous peoples and their traditional territories. We do this as an expression of gratitude and appreciation to those whose territories we reside in, and to honor the Indigenous people who have been living with and caring for their lands from time immemorial. Recognizing them also means acknowledging the historical and ongoing genocide of Indigenous peoples and the ways in which we benefit from the perpetual violence towards Indigenous peoples. Naming the original and current stewards of the land we live on is a first step towards making reparations. I reside in Washington, D.C., and I live on the ancestral lands of the Nakotang and the Piscataway people. We believe the work we do in sessions like these is part of our responsibility to acknowledge and address the ongoing harm of Indigenous peoples, our work towards a society that is more just and equitable, and in keeping with the ethics of Ismaili Muslims. Our topic for this session today is exploring the Shia tradition, understanding the continuity of Imamate, which explores the vision of the Imams' guidance across the centuries on the ethic and spirit of inquiry, compassion, and stewardship. During this session, you will see a Q&A box where you can share additional questions and thoughts during the presentation. We will try to address as many questions submitted during today's talk as we can. With that, I am honored to introduce you to our wonderful speaker for today's session, Dr. Hussein Rashid. Dr. Hussein Rashid has a PhD and is a scholar specializing in Muslims in the US, popular culture, and the Shia justice theologies. He is also founder of a consultancy, Islamicite, L3C, focusing on religious literacy. His books include Miss Marvel's America, No Normal, which was co-edited with Jessica Baldenzi, Muslims in North America, which was co-edited with Huma, sorry, I'm probably going to mispronounce this, Mibuela, Teaching Critical Religious Studies, co-edited with Jenna Gray Hildebrand and Beverly McGuire, and forthcoming, the Bloomsbury Handbook of Muslim Popular Culture, co-edited with Christina Peterson and Muslims in the US. With the Children's Museum of Manhattan exhibit, America to Zanzibar, Muslim Cultures Near and Far, Dr. Rashid has worked on exhibit design, community engagement, and curricula development. He was an executive producer for an award-winning New York Times short animated documentary, The Secret History of Muslims in the US. He is currently an executive producer for a multi-hour, multi-format documentary on Muslims in the US called American Muslim Stories. He served as an advisor on the Brooklyn Historical Society's project Muslims in Brooklyn and an opera on the life of Omar Ibn Said called Omar, about the only known autobiography of an enslaved Muslim in the US written in Arabic. He is currently working on various museums in the Smithsonian on projects related to religion. He also teaches at the New School and Union Theological Seminary. His Jamaati experiences include being a junior volunteer, a member of one of the first Ismaili Boy Scout troops, Troop 25, the scholar and a director of the original Aluma, managing and creating content for the Al-Ilm camp for high school students, developing content for the Golden Jubilee Initiative, the Heritage Discovery Program, and serving 2 terms as a scholar on National ITREB. So amazing, amazing stuff. Before we dive in, I'd like to note that the views of our speakers expressed during the course of the discussion are their own. And let's now turn to our conversation. Dr. Rashid, as we begin, could you please share a little bit about who Shia Imams are and what their role as Imams are in terms of the guidance that they've provided to our communities over the years?
Bismillah, Yali Madad, Dr. Naaila and Yali Madad, everybody in attendance, thank you for being here. As Dr. Naaila said, land acknowledgements are an important part of our practice, and I'm from Manhattan, the traditional land of the Lenape people. And thank you for that really overlong and generous introduction. I feel now talking about the Imams, I have to make sure that these opportunities that you've read are by service and the ability to serve Imam Zaman and the guidance we have to serve humanity. And I think that to me is an important thing to keep in mind, is that we are always given an opportunity to serve in the capacities in which we're able, and do we always take that opportunity? And I think when we look historically, this has been something that has come up from the guidance of the Imams throughout time. We have a wonderful series on the Ismaili called What Ismailis Believe, which gets into a variety of speakers talking about history of the Imams. And so I'm just going to try to summarize some of that material and encourage our audience to really spend some time on that series, which does get into questions of our belief and questions of our history in much greater depth than I think I can do any justice to in the time we have. Historically, the way we've understood the Imams is that when prophethood ceases with Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that Imamate becomes the organizing factor of the community, in the way in which we believe the Prophet's spiritual, religious, political, material authority survives him and is transmitted through the Ahl Bayt, and very specifically through the children of Imam Ali alayhi salam and Bibi Fatima alayhi salam. And we are blessed to be the only Shi'i community with a Hazar Imam, and that continuity, that 1400 years of guidance is vouchsafed for us in the Quran, in the prophetic guidance, saying that we will always have this with us, and it is a way for us to organize our community, to organize our lives, and to lead the transformation in the world that the Imam wishes for us in that space. And so we see within, I would argue, from in this 1400 years of history, and arguably we can go back to Nabuwah as well, but really we're talking about Imamate here, is that there is a continuity of ethical guidance that I think we can see across the centuries. So the particularities change, right? Because our material conditions change. It doesn't make sense, for example, to talk about the ethics of the internet 100 years ago. That's not germane. But the ethics of human connectivity, the ethics of trying to keep communities together, the ethics of trying to be kind to one another, I would argue, are resonant throughout time.
I wholeheartedly agree. When we think about religion in any format, we think about those key principles of community and engagement, compassion, some of the underlying factors that come in. Do you have any stories that from our early Imams that you might be able to share about some of these continuous themes that come up through the Imam's guidance?
So I think maybe before I get into some of the questions of themes, maybe I can talk a little bit more about the roles of the Imams, because we talked about it. I talked about it a little bit in the sense of guide in terms of guidance, which is a really important part of the role the Imam plays in our life. But because of this historical background, right, the Imamat, wa kullu shay'in asaynahu fi imami mubin, we have vested knowledge of everything in the manifest Imam, right? This is Quranic, that we have prophetic guidance, right? Man kuntu maulahu fahada aliyun maulahu. He whose Mola I am, Ali is his Mola. This is what the Prophet says at Ghadir Qum. We can turn to parts of the dua that come from the Quran that talk about the Prophet, God commanding the Prophet to reveal what has been revealed to him and fear not of the people, because we understand that as being, this is the declaration of Ghadir. And this declaration of Ghadir then also becomes a segue or a vehicle for us to understand our devotional life to the Imams, right? Whether we look at Qasidas, whether we look at Ginans, we have this devotional literature to the Imams, but very specifically, the phrase Man kuntu mawlahu is the opening of almost every Qawwali concert or every Qawwali Sama that you'll go to, is this Qawwal. Is this Qawwali? Man kuntu mawlahu fahada aliyun mawlahu. And the role Imam Ali alayhi salam plays in Muslim thought and Muslim imagination is not just limited to the Shia. And so we have this particular devotion to the Imams, but Imam Ali, Imam Hussein alayhi salam, they become important figures in broader Muslim life. And so we're embedded in this larger devotional life. Our devotional life is embedded in this larger devotion to the Imams that's shared across traditions and gives us this language. And I think that we have to take that very seriously, right? So the Imam is the center of guidance, is our kutub, is the center of our community, is a center of our devotional life, gives us legalistic or gives us legal companions, right? Imam Jafar Sadiq alayhi salam is known as a great legal scholar, for example. He's known to have trained many of the founders of the Sunni law schools. And so we turn to this idea of this relationship of Sharia, Tariqa, Marifa, Hakika. We look at all these in relationship to one another, and it's always within the sphere, in the orbit of Imam Zaman. And I think that that becomes an important part that, when I talk about guidance, it sounds very simple and straightforward, but we have to understand how many different parts and how many different manifestations in our life it has, from speeches and irshads and farmans and hadaya, right? These are manifestations of guidance, but all the different spheres of our life that this guidance touches. And so when we talk about guidance, we tend to think of it as like, I think our instinct is to simplify it and say, what does the Imam say about X? Which is true. I mean, the Imam gives us very clear guidance in many instances. But sometimes the guidance is, you have the guidance. What am I calling you to do? And I think that's always the harder part, is saying, how do I sit with this and absorb this and internalize it so that it's not just the 2 minutes I'm hearing the fraction of a Farman in Jamaat Khana, but is part of every waking moment, right? And this is what I mean when I talk about legalism and devotionalism, right? We have this beautiful Qawwali that's based on a Qasida, Dam Hamadam Ali Ali, right? Which is with every breath call Ali. And if we are serious about intentionally every second calling Ali as a devotional act, then shouldn't that have an impact on our behavior, which is a Zahiri act, which is a Sharia act, because of this tariqa practice? And doesn't it also have quote unquote legal implications? What do we eat? What do we not eat? How do we treat other people? That's also an ethical act, right? So this devotional, legal, ethical, to try to split it neatly doesn't make sense. When I talk about the Imam's guidance, I think I'm thinking much larger. And that's why for me, it's interesting to look at Imamate guidance, not just in the context of Imam Zaman, which is incredibly important, but thinking about what is it we're being called to do? What is the challenge to us, not just in terms of that very specific point of guidance, but what is it that it is trying to construct for us? What is the world the Imam wants us to build out of it?
That speaks to me so much, because as I reflect on my own journey through spirituality, and as I know is very common for our teenagers and young adults in the Jamaat, is that sometimes we step away from Jamaat Khane, but that doesn't necessarily mean we step away from our faith. And how we live our faith on a daily basis isn't just when we come to a space of prayer or a space of community. It's when we are doing what we do on a day-to-day basis, and whatever that path is that we've chosen to take, how are we living those ethics of our faith? I'd like to explore the concept of inquiry that comes up often within the guidance that we receive. Specifically, like, what does it mean for our community to continue to inquire about life, about nature, about existence? I'll let you take it from there and follow up.
Yeah, I think, thank you, Dr. Nala. I think I would say education is one part of inquiry. And I think the way you split it up makes a lot of sense to me, in that we have a formal education. There's a formal education system we're used to, right? In the context of the United States, at least that's what I'll speak to. That's what I'm most familiar with. You have elementary school, you have secondary school, you go to college, you go to university. And we tend to think of that as formal education. A good education to me is always about wanting to learn. That's the field of inquiry. You're getting an education because you want to learn. And in getting an education, you're learning how to learn. So you continue to want to learn once your education is over. In other words, the point of an education is not to get a job. The point of an education is to be of service to others. And I think let me spend a little bit of time on education and then talk a little bit about inquiry. I think I grew up in a time in the US, there was a lot of talk about this idea of meritocracy in the 80s, that you be meritocratic, you live in a meritocratic system and you should do the best that you can. And I think we as a Jamaat heard that in the best possible way, and recognizing that we should try to be the best that we can be. And I think, unfortunately, how it manifested was brand name shopping. You get into Harvard, or you haven't really succeeded in education, as opposed to what is the best school you can get into, and and the best school is not necessarily the brand name school. The best school is the thing that will give you the best education to help other people, to help the Jamaat, to discover Allah's creation, right? The purpose of education, the purpose of inquiry is to better understand Allah's creation, to better understand Allah. And I think that we then got a corrective when we started getting into this question of the knowledge society, that no, in fact, for example, to get an education only for your own benefit is an act of intellectual vanity, right? Is the type of thing that we then started learning and hearing about. And I think that when we take Imams and Imams guidance in and of itself, it can lead to us thinking very much of the moment, right? Because when this guidance on meritocracy came out, it was again, I'm speaking very specifically the context of the US, it was the heyday of individualism and narcissism and glorifying that sort of nafs, right? Saying the very thing our religious tradition tells us not to elevate, which is our nafs, was the system we were living in. And so when we heard this guidance, it's saying, well, wait, what does this mean in the context of our tradition? We started turning around and saying, what does this mean in the context of the United States in the 80s and 90s? And it's almost antithetical to what our tradition is, because when we think about education in the context of our tradition, right? Imam Ali, he says, every container grows smaller when you put something in it. It grows smaller in capacity when you put something in it, except the container of knowledge, right? The more knowledge you have, the greater the container of knowledge expands, right? We have the establishment of these educational institutions. There's a beautiful story of Imam al-Mu'izz in the Royal Library, alayhi salam, in the Royal Library, was looking for a book and couldn't find the book, and kept pulling these books off the shelf, and kept reading all night while he was looking for this one book, right? And we've all had, I think, those experiences as educators, at least, where we're all looking for that one thing, for that class, for that paper, and we're just up all night. We're like, I'm looking for this one thing, but oh, this thing is interesting, this thing is, and we can share that experience. But to understand Al-Azhar is as an educational space was so phenomenal, because it said education was a right that people had access to. In other words, you didn't pay to go to Al-Azhar. The materials were supplied for you, right? So you didn't pay for paper and pen and ink and all, like the equivalent of the photocopier. You went and all this was provided for you. You had the best teachers coming in. And then we can go post Fatimid to the library at Alamut, and we can jump ahead to the modern period, right, where the Library of Alamut is eventually destroyed. And why? Because knowledge is dangerous. Knowledge is power, right? And the Imams are saying gain knowledge, and other people are saying no, don't gain knowledge, because it allows you to search for Allah's creation. It allows you to break monopolies of oppression. It allows you to say there's a different way we can be in the world. Knowledge is a way of understanding your true worth as an individual, as a society, because it puts you in a different type of relationship with Allah. And people are coming and saying, no, we need to be between you and Allah. And the Imam is saying, no, follow this path, right? And then we jump ahead to the modern period and we get AKU and ISMC and IIS and University of Central Asia, right? Then there's this ethical commitment is there telling people seek knowledge, seek knowledge, seek knowledge. And so for me, this is about an educational commitment, but it's an educational commitment, not like get a degree and get a job, right? But you have to understand how revolutionary these, let's come back to Al-Azhar, how revolutionary Al-Azhar was, right? When we were in power, during the Fatimid period, or more accurately, when the Imams are in power, they are committing acts of political revolution. And what I mean by this is that they're not trying to expand the empire through conflict. They're trying to expand the empire through reputation. They're trying to say, we have the best thinkers. We have the best philosophers. We have the best scientists. We have the best artists, right? Which is not to say that there wasn't war and there wasn't conflict. Let's not pretend. I don't want to pretend that isn't true. But it isn't about expansion through conquest. It's expansion through intellect. The impact that Al-Azhar has, right, throughout the Muslim world, when you see comparable and parallel institutions being built up, the library at Alamut, the parallels as other libraries and other institutions are being established to try to create something like that. Right, we have to understand that these are revolutionary acts. So when we have power in Al-Azhar, we're committing revolutionary acts of education. When we're on the defensive in Alamut, we're committing revolutionary acts of education. And so when we think about meritocracy, and I think about it historically, that should be a call for revolutionary acts of education, that the education is not about your nafs, the education is about the Jamaat. And this is where the Knowledge Society, I think, is taking us. But I think, again, we're getting complacent with that. We have to think, what is it we're being called to, rather than what is the very specific thing we're being asked of right now? In other words, what we're being asked of right now, how does that set up 5 years, 10 years, 20 years down the line, rather than how does it benefit us right now at this moment only?
I think that's amazing. Going off on a little bit of a tangent, unplanned, but what are your thoughts on how we might approach discovering what our purpose is, where we're meant to go with the guidance that the Imam is giving? Is it, climate change is big right now, and there are conversations happening about, educating ourselves in specific areas, or worrying about the recession that's taking place in the United States, and across the globe. Where do you think should we focus on the guidance that is coming through right now, the big topics, or should we be following some other path?
So I'm never one to interject myself between a murid and the murshid, right? I mean, it's very clear. The Imams have said historically that that's not anybody's role. It's in our constitution. I think more broadly, what I would say is always follow the guidance of Imam Zaman, right? I mean, that's in the particular and in the general. But I think when I use this term nafs. This term nafs literally means, it's sometimes used as soul, but within more Batini groups, whether Sufi or Ismaili, or different types, or other different types of Shia. When we think about these Batini groups, nafs means our more basic selfish desires, right? Sometimes in English psychological terms, our ego, right? And how do we control our nafs? And I think that if we think we can create greatness by ourselves, that is our nafs. If we think we can go through challenges in our lives by ourselves, that is nafs. That everything is always about the community. And we forget that every day we are called to go to the Jamaat Khana, the community house, the gathering house. That it is about people. It is about how are we in service to others who can then who can help us in our times of need. And I don't want to make it sound so utilitarian, right? But I'm of an age now where, I've experienced several of my elders pass away. And the first time the Jamaat comes in, you're like, why are you intruding on this private grief? The first day. Then the second day, you're like, if it wasn't for the Jamaat, you couldn't get through this private grief because this grief isn't private. and you say, it's an old, it's a little saying, but I kind of like it. I think it's appropriate. Joy shared is doubled, grief shared is halved, right? And who do you do that with? You have your family, you have your friends, you have your Jamaat. When you are struggling, right? The Quran talks about giving away your money, no matter how much you cherish it, give away your money. And you give it to people in need, and you give it to the beggars. And I always do this with my students in the classes that I teach. I ask them, what's the difference between a beggar and somebody who's needy, right? And the beggar are the structurally poor, the people we've decided are not worth us taking care of. And so that's a commandment to say, how do we end chronic homelessness in this country? How do we end chronic hunger in this country, right? It's because it's not like we don't have the money. It's just we've chosen to say, you are not worth having a home, you are not worth feeding. We're making these decisions as a society, right? Because we say it's not my individual ability. And so there's a call there to think about community, but the needy is the individual need. Like if I God forbid, lose my job and need some money, and the Jamaat should come forward and say, we will help you for this month or so while you get back on your feet, right? Or health issue, that will come forward and help you get back on your feet, inshallah. And so that is the idea, that we're committed to people more than money, right? This is in the Quran. This is 2:177. If anybody wants to look it up, but it's very clear. Give away your money. It's not your money, it's God's money. Right? But who are you giving it to? You're giving it to people we as a society have chosen, we often neglect, but it's about people to people interaction, right? And so thinking about that as an ethical commitment. And so your question about, well, we're in a recession, we have this calamity, we have this thing coming up, we're in a pandemic, we're in multiple pandemics at this point now, right? We're in a tridemic, flu and RSV and COVID. That yes, this is all true. And we have somebody to share it with, which is the Jamaat, but we also have Allah and Allah's chosen representative, the Imam, to share it with, that these are places where we can double our joy and half our grief, half our worries, and we can also seek guidance and support from both spiritual and material from that community. And I think it's about reinvesting back into our people, that in our lowest points, we should be reinvesting in people and people's relationships. And in our highest points, we should be investing in people and people's relationships.
So going back to something that you said, it was very intriguing and very exciting for me, because you mentioned going back to our community, our Jamaat, for whatever challenges we may have, setting aside our ego, our nafs, and asking for support from the community that is with us. That community needs to be made up of diverse people to be able to support us in the diverse areas that may be of need. Compassion comes to mind as we're talking about this. And I know there's, so much in the Quran about compassion. Could you talk a little bit more about that theme of compassion, and who is that compassion for? You alluded to it a little bit about needy, as we go to those communities, but would love for you to elaborate a little bit more on that.
So probably the most frequent attributes attributed to God in the Quran are Rahman and Rahim, right? We begin every part of our dua with this, every part of Sharia worship, every part of Tariqah worship with, we even began this talk, Bismillah Rahman Rahim, right? In the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful. And for me, these attributes, the reason this attribute is most frequently cited is that it is a call to us to say, which of these divine qualities can we manifest, right? And I think the Imam, when you look at the institutions the Imams have established historically, they've always been about other people, right? Again, I'll come back to Al-Azhar, I'll look at the AKDN. These are institutions that are not meant just for Ismailis, right? Because the goal is to lift society up as a whole, because then we benefit. If only we benefit at a time, if only we as a subgroup of Ismailis benefit, or I as an individual benefit, that's a precarious position. Because if I succeed by myself, I will fall by myself, right? Whereas if I succeed with other people, everybody succeeds, and everybody. In other words, I would rather have 10% of everything with 10 other people for my lifetime than 100% of everything for 1 year before I lose everything for 90 years of my lifetime, right? And that the idea that I don't need 100% of it, I need enough, right? And how do we get enough, right? And thinking about that enoughness, that completeness. And for me, that's what Rahman and Rahim are about, that mercy and compassion are about, is recognizing when I have enough and who doesn't have enough, and then how to share that enough so everybody has enough, right? It's about feeling for other people, feeling with other people, and sharing those feelings, recognizing those situations, and structuring a society that allows that, right? Whether it's institutional, whether it's social, how do we generate that space? And one of the things that has always struck me is that the root of Rahman and Rahim, Rama, this root in Arabic is the same root. It's the same root that gives us the word womb, W-O-M-B, the place where birthing happens. In other words, it's a generative act. It's something that can be created, but something that has to be birthed and has to be brought into the world. It just doesn't automatically happen. It's something we have to be conscious of. So I come back to that, dam hamadam Ali Ali. With her dam, with each breath, call Ali. That as you're calling Ali, you know, this idea of saying, oh, take out your tasbih on the bus, call Ya Muhammad, Ya Ali on the bus, can be a private and selfish act. I don't have to go to community prayer, or I can't go to community prayer, but that doesn't mean I'm not interested in transforming the world because I'm still committed to them, right? And understanding, for me, our prayer is a deeply compassionate act if we're thoughtful about it. Prayer in general, it is an eruption in our day. It is a way to say, this day has to be broken up and we have to recommit. We have to commit and recommit to God with every moment. And this idea that we're calling out tasbih, we're calling Ali, Imam Ali at every opportunity, is a way to constantly interrupt the day to say, my purpose in life is not to work, right? In other words, work is not the end. Work is the means. My purpose in life is to work, to be able to do what to change the world, to benefit the world, right? And I think that, to me, is the very, I keep talking about revolution, I keep talking about radicalism, but for me, religion is the practice of religion is an incredibly radical act, right? It is a reminder that we're not in it for ourselves, that we are not here to abuse God's creation. We are here to be servants to God's creation. For me, every time I go through Imamate guidance, and again, I mean historically, not just Imam Zaman, you know, you talked about environmental stewardship, and I agree 100%, but there's a portion. Imam Ali writes this very well-known letter to Malik al-Ashtar. This is in the book. You can find a translation of this in the book Justice and Remembrance by Reza Shah Kazmi. And Malik al-Ashtar is this man Imam Ali is appointed as governor of Egypt, and he's given in this letter on how to lead. And, you know, there's things like, you know, don't trust the wealthy people who are only interested in wealth because all they care about is wealth. They will sink the society in order to keep their wealth. It's an amazingly far-sighted article of foresight and guidance, you know, but that people who give of their money to help society, they're the ones who will be your allies. Sit with the disabled, sit with the people who don't have access to you, because they're the people who have most of access to you. But one thing he tells Imam Ali tells Malik al-Ashtar, he says, do not tax the land so that people are always plowing all their land. And you're like, well, that's an interesting bit of guidance. Why wouldn't people always be plowing all their land, right? Because you think about it, we have to maximize efficiency, to use modern terminology. But if you think about it, right, this is regenerative farming, is that if you're always plowing all the land, you deplete all the resources of the land. The land is no longer fertile. Within a generation, that land will no longer be fertile. You can no longer farm it. In other words, you will destroy God's creation. You will destroy yourself by being extractive. And so in Imam Ali's letter is an admonishment to care for God's creation, right? And to make sure you're not being extractive on the land. And so again, I think there is a continuity of guidance that we can point to that has always been about stewardship and care for Allah's creation as a means to know Allah. And that our ritual practice is also in that remembrance of Allah, is a remembrance of Allah's creation, and is a call, is a desire to continue to care for it.
Yeah, as you're telling this story, it comes to mind that, if we farm the land, over farm the land, we're not going to be able to continue to regenerate year after year. It's going to lose its power. It also brings to mind the idea of self-compassion and caring for ourselves. If we have this mindset of meritocracy and we're constantly working for more and more and more without giving back anything, are we also then wearing ourselves out to where we won't be able to do that, do our jobs, fulfill our careers, fulfill our purpose? Would love for you to talk a little bit about ideas of self-compassion that might come up through the Imams, firmans over the time, or guidance.
Or guidance, yeah. So how do you when I talk about interrupting the day and ritual and religion being a way to interrupt the day, isn't that a moment of self-care, right? In other words, are we bodies with a soul, or are we souls with a body? And I think that when we say we're bodies with a soul, then we take care of the body first and the soul second. When we say we're souls with a body, we tend to take care of our soul first and our bodies second. And I don't mean that in an abusive way that we need to wear ourselves out. We shouldn't take care of ourselves, right? But this body is the vehicle that has to be cared for in order to nourish the soul. The soul is the primary element, right? So whether that's good eating, whether that's exercise, the need for rest and breaks, right? And I think there's lots of, and interestingly enough, I am going to turn back to the US context, because I think there's lots of work out of Black feminist scholarship, people like Bell Hooks, for example, who write about the Comahoe River Collective is another example, Audre Lorde, right? The idea of self-care as being a revolutionary act. And they're not necessarily using religious language, but the idea that you're taking care of yourself, not in a selfish way, but in a way that allows you to rejuvenate, to be able to change the world again, right? So that it's a revolutionary act in that you're always being tasked to do things that wear you down, that keep you from being able to realize your true potential. Because your true potential, right? If you know your worth, right? I keep coming back to this idea that Al-Azhar was free, Alamut was free because it was important that people know things, right? That you understood your self-worth, that if you understand your self-worth, you understand that work is not your self-worth. You are not your job. Your job is a means to an end. It is not the end in and of itself. And I think that when you think about self-care, we have to think about it in the same way. It's not that I will work enough to be able to go to a resort or to a spa and take care of myself. It's that I will work enough to be able to make sure I can support my family, I can take care of other people, I can work to change the world, and I can keep my religious commitments. Now, recognizing that not all jobs allow you to go to Jamaat Khana, right? Because I think that that also is something we have to recognize, that we live in a society where work doesn't always allow you to go to Jamaat Khana, but that doesn't absolve you of your religious commitments, right? In other words, there's a both-and situation here, that you can still participate in this way of reimagining the world and thinking about what is the world I'm being called to create? What is the world that I'm an agent of creating? And how am I working towards that as the purpose of the day job, if you will, right? And I think that that's the important element that we have to keep in mind. And the religion and religious ritual is a way to go beyond that, right? And to think beyond the day job.
I love that. Just reflecting on how even our prayer can bring us back to self-care, being compassionate to ourselves, and realizing that um, Allah is compassionate to us too. So we should do it for ourselves, especially in such a difficult and challenging time, with the recession, with so many layoffs taking place. People are struggling, and wherever we can find that compassion for ourselves and for others, we certainly should. And it sounds like our prayers day to day can do that for us. You mentioned this idea of
Sorry,
having,
Dr.
yeah, go
Sorry,
ahead.
can I just jump in for 1 second? Because you'd mentioned something else I just want to pick up, which is, the struggle you have with religion. I think this is really important, right? Is that I grew up, born and bred New Yorker. I grew up, I really struggled with religion and being a Somali when I was a kid. My parents, my family, they did right by me. It's nothing that they did. It's just you're in this environment, but they gave me a good grounding and a good basis, right? Like they were one of the pioneer families in New York. We were in Jamaat kind of 12 hours a day on the weekend, on a short day, just because the Jamaat had to be built, right? And we had that experience. And I had an experience at Aluma which showed me what a community could be, right? So that even when I sort of drifted away from the Jamaat Khana, I never really drifted away from being Ismaili. And I came back to that when I was ready for it. But that compassion and that vision of what a community could be and look like had been implanted in me, right? And I think that is something we don't take seriously enough, is that you and I are talking about people in our lives who were past a particular type of youthful questioning. We're in a different type of questioning, right? That mode of inquiry that you talked about, because we should always be inquiring. But I think that, when I was 16, 17, if I didn't have that beautiful community that Aluma, the potential of a beautiful community that Aluma presented to me, if I didn't have that potential of saying, this is what a compassionate community looks like, as opposed to a work community where I come for an hour to take a break and then I go back to work, I'm not sure I would have the same relationship to Ismailism and Imamism that I do now.
I think that's a very fair statement. I think there's probably a lot of parents on this call who are wondering, okay, that's wonderful. I want to give my child a sense of community, but going to Jamaat Khane regularly is hard. And Aluma only selects a small handful of youth. What are other ways in which parents might be able to engage children in this idea of a compassionate, or in this structure of a compassionate community?
I think that's a great observation. So when I went to Aluma, the Jamaat was significantly smaller and it wasn't serving such a small percentage of the Jamaat. It was a much higher percentage of the Jamaat, right? But there are all sorts of really great programs that our Jamaat runs. REC, I think, I think I was sort of past me, but my cousins went to a Jamaati SAT prep course that was run with, I can't remember, one of the big companies, right, where they, they arranged a big discount. And it was a way to sort of socialize before Jamaat Khana. You'd spend 3 hours in Jamaat Khana, they would run the SAT course and the social lobby, and then 40 minutes later was Jamaat Khana. So you had this experience of being with your peers, and then you would go to Jamaat Khana. And it was, I think, I just point that out because I know we're approaching SAT season now. And I'm sure it's on some parents' minds, if not their kids' minds. But I think we have all this wonderful programming that the Jamaat runs, but it's also trying to find, when I went to college with 5, 6 other Ismailis, and we didn't have an official Ismaili Students Association, but we all kind of knew each other, and we did dua on campus, and just that simple thing, right, that the Ismaili Students Network is trying to do. I mean, these are very low, simple things that they don't have to be high intensive labor, but it's always, for me, when I used to run youth programming, it was always like, what does this tariqa mean to you? And how are you cultivating that relationship with Imam Zaman? And can you find other people who are trying to cultivate similar relationships? Because it's always about finding your people, right? And how do you do that? It's not, we're all Ismailis, we're all in this together, but there is a generosity, I think, that comes from finding people who are struggling in the same ways you are. And I'll give one very specific example. There's a guy I grew up with in New York. And politically, we disagree on a lot of things. I still consider him a good friend, but when Barack Obama was running for president for the first time, he was hosting a fundraising dinner with South Asian and Arab Muslim community type things. And my friend called me up and he said, look, do you want to go? I said, yeah, I'd love to go. I can't afford the ticket. He said, well, look, I can afford the ticket. I don't know what I'm saying. So you're going to be my +1. I'll pay for your ticket. You come and you're going to talk to the candidate. And I'm like, that's how the Jamaat should function, right? Like, he's my friend. We can disagree, but here's an opportunity to engage something for the benefit of the Jamaat, that he's like, I have one set of resources. You have another set of resources. How do we pool them to do something better together? Right. And I think that, to me, is what we're searching for, is how do we cultivate those relationships and those opportunities to say, how is what I've done, how is what I have achieved of being able to be of service to somebody else and then to the Jamaat in general.
Absolutely. So coming back to the Imam's guidance and bringing all of this conversation together, when we think about this Imam's guidance about inquiry and compassion and working as a community, is that guidance timeless or time bound? How would you describe uh, over the centuries everything that we've received?
It's a, for me, it's a both and, Dr. Naaila. It's, the particularities of some guidance is very much time bound, and the ethical guidance, I would argue, is timeless. That's why I argue about consistency of ethics rather than the particularities of the guidance. Now, having said that, it's not up to me to decide what is time bound and what is timeless, right? That is the Imam's prerogative. That is the Imam's guidance, right? I think, and I know you said this at the beginning, it's worth me reiterating that when I'm speaking here, I am not speaking on behalf of the Imam. I would be ashamed if anybody here thought I was speaking on behalf of the Imam. That is the Imam's prerogative to authorize whom he will to speak on his behalf on what this guidance means. I am trying to give a reflection on my understanding, my personal understanding of the guidance over time and place from a very ethical lens. And just to be transparent, right? I start with two premises, one of which you've already hit. One, the first revelation is Iqra, read or recite. Iqra ba'ismi rabbikum, read in the name of your Lord who created you, right? And so that there's the idea of obedience, of servitude, of gratitude embedded in that for me, so that inquiry, education, reading, learning are the first revelation, and that we begin everything with Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, in the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful. So compassion, mercy, inquiry, I think is the word we've settled on, are sort of the starting points. And everything for me is read through that lens of compassion, mercy, and inquiry. And what is that meant to cultivate? What is that meant to lead us towards? And I think there's a Fatimid thinker, and I'm sorry, I'm blanking on his name, but you can find this in the anthology of Ismaili literature that the IIS has published, where he says, you cannot say that God is one. When you talk about Tawheed, we say, oh, Tawheed means God is one. But the second you say God is one, this is this Fatimid thinker, I think it's Kirmani, but don't quote me on that, but it's in this anthology. He says, when you say that God is one, you are limiting God. So you cannot say God is one, right? So Tawheed is beyond our notions of oneness and two-ness and separateness, right? And then there's this Isnashri thinker by the name of Ali Shariati, right? And this is a very common theme in Shi'i thought, this idea that you can't say God is one. This idea, this Isnashri thinker, Ali Shariati, says, well, if you say God is, Tawheed is God's unicity, is how he says it. It's God's unicity, the completeness and all-encompassing nature of God. Then anything that divides us, right, is inherently breaking God's Tawheed. So if you say that there are class differences that are structural, that are inherent in people, then you're breaking God's Tawheed. If you say that there are gender differences, if you say there are racial differences, if you say there are educational differences that are inherent in people, then you're breaking God's Tawheed. And so for me, this to me feels like a natural extension of this Fatimid thought. Then the goal, the purpose is not to say, how do we divide ourselves as human beings and thereby breaking God's Tawheed, but rather to take God's Tawheed seriously and this idea of compassion and mercy and say, how do we meet each other's needs and make ourselves more whole rather than make ourselves more incomplete. And that to me is fulfilling this notion of God's Tawheed. So when we say, Kulu Allahu Ahad, Allahu Samad, Lam Yalid, Lam Yulad, Lam Yakul Lahu Kufuwan Ahad, right? That we have to take that Ahad seriously. And we have to take that unicity seriously. We have to take that notion of Tawheed seriously. And so for me to talk about the timelessness and time-bound nature of the Imam's guidance is something I would never do without the Imam's explicit instructions. And also say that I have a very particular positionality, which is that when we say Ali Imam Manastam Manam Ghulame Ali, Ali is my Imam and I'm the servant of Ali, it is a recognition of this first revelation of the Quran, because God has given us the Imams to guide our way. And so that servitude, coming back to the ayat of the Quran, that we are giving our hands in allegiance, right? That when our hand is on the Prophet's hands or then the Imam's hands, it is God is making the compact with us. That is the connection. Then I have to think about God, the Imamate guidance on what we are being called towards, which is this unicity of compassion, unicity of creation, and think about God's compassion and mercy through inquiry.
That's amazing. Thank you so much for all of the amazing thoughts that you've shared so far. Few things that I want to highlight that really spoke to me was just the amount of gratitude I feel for having this conversation, but also for the guidance that we receive from the Imams, and for the people who have come before us and the guidance that they've received from the Imams over the centuries. Just such a blessing to have that as we think about how to live our lives on a daily basis, how to engage with our faith in meaningful ways that regenerates us, that also helps us build compassion for others. You mentioned something that brought to mind a quote. C.S. Lewis, who many of you will know, wrote the Narnia books, has said that you don't have a soul, you are a soul, and you have a body, and let's take care of nurturing that soul so that we then nurture the joint soul that we have with everyone, the nur that we share with everyone around us. So those are just some thoughts that came to mind during our conversation. With that and everything that we've spoken about, there are a number of questions that have come in from the audience, and I want to make sure we save some time for that. And we would love to hear your insights. So if you don't mind, I would love to jump into these questions.
Please, thank you.
So our first question is, when we speak about higher learning, we rarely hear about the manuscripts in Male, and their scholars have reportedly lectured at Al-Azhar. Is this omission due to the colonialism or something else, perhaps?
So I'm not quite sure where the questions come from. So for members of the Jamaat who may not be as well versed, Timbuktu was a major center of Muslim learning, and there's a library in Timbuktu. I'm assuming this is what the manuscripts in Mali are being referenced to, is in reference to. And it was a major center. The AKDN agencies are involved amongst numerous other institutions in preserving and digitizing those manuscripts and trying to save the scholars, or were involved in trying to save the scholars there as well. They did come to Al-Azhar. Some of you may know the story of Mansa Musa. He comes from this area, incredibly wealthy, 15th century. I don't know how it relates to colonialism. I think that there is something in the way in which, and I say this as an academic who studies Islam, where there is a lot of racism in the field where we don't talk about the contribution of African Muslims to our history, the teaching and preservation of our knowledge. And I think that that has transmitted through time. But again, knowledge comes from all sources, and to break across lines of race, I think, is to break God's Tawheed, to break the idea of Tawheed. So I'm not sure where the questions come from, but that's how I would read and understand the question. That there is a lot of racism. I don't know if there's necessarily colonialism, and that our heritage does include places like Timbuktu and Touba, Senegal, as well as obviously the Swahili coast and Nigeria. That's all part of our heritage as well.
Thank you. Our next question is, how do you reconcile between charity to help the needy and the AKDN ethical framework of making marginalized people self-reliant to maintain their dignity and become masters of their own destiny?
I really appreciate this question, whoever asked it, because I think I don't see a need for reconciliation. I'll explain why in a second, but I think what this points to is English language terms don't map out neatly into what our terms within our tradition mean. So, for example, Hazrat Imam in a speech think it was Tutzing, Germany, where he says the work of the imam is not philanthropy. I'm paraphrasing here, but the work of the imam is not philanthropy. That's not what this is, right? Philanthropy is the idea of helping other people and, spreading your wealth type of thing. The work of the imam, he doesn't go on to define what it is, but I think when you go back and you look at terms like sadaqah, which is often in English translated as charity, in our tradition, it actually comes from the root to mean justice, that you're not giving charity, you're giving justice to people in need, right? And that justice can look like, let me give you some money for now to help you bridge, right? Or it can, shouldn't say or, and it can be make people self-reliant. In other words, these are not mutually exclusive. Sometimes people simply need cash to bridge, to make themselves masters of their own destiny. And sometimes you need a radical restructuring of society. So for me, it's not different, but I think unfortunately English translates it as charity. Charity is this idea is that, charity in English is this idea is that I'm giving you something and there might be a sense of obligation or reciprocity implied. Justice is not that. Justice is about healing a rift, about doing something that creates a sense of equity or a sense of healing in society. So I think this is where I don't see there needs to be a big reconciliation. I think the problem is in English, when we rely on English rather than the languages in which these terms were developed in, whether it's Arabic or Persian or Urdu or Gujarati or Sindhi or Kutchi, Tajik, Dari, whatever the case may be.
Thank you so much for that. I think the question, as you said, was very, very important, and I really appreciate your answer there. Do you think there is a cultural shift in the community to enhance the potential of our community?
I'm going to come at that in two ways, I think. The first is during the Golden Jubilee. By the way, the Quranic ayat, I don't know if anybody remembers, for the Golden Jubilee was 4:1. We were all created from one soul, speaking to this idea of Tawheed and these artificial distinctions that we make. But during the Golden Jubilee, it was where were we 50 years ago and where are we now as a Jamaat? And you think about from 1957, where the Jamaat was to where it is now, in terms of the institution building that we've done, in terms of the wealth that has been generated within the Jamaat, in terms of the overall increasing education level of the Jamaat, our ability to recognize that there are needs and quality of life that we as a Jamaat can fulfill, and creating those programs to help the Jamaat's quality of life, I think is a huge shift in what the community is. And I would love for us to be explicit about our ethical underpinnings that have informed that to guide us for the next 50 years, right? Or 50 years from that point, so the next 40 years now, as we've done another Jubilee. The other way I would answer that is we are the community, right? We are the Jamaat. Our institutions are not the Jamaat. Our institutions reflect guidance from the Imam and where the Jamaat is willing to meet the Imam. Our institutions are mediating that space. And so the question is not, have we as a community shifted? The question is, how am I shifting? Have I shifted enough to be able to move the community? And am I working towards meeting the Imam's guidance for us? We tend to look at our institutions as anchors. And look, institutions are inherently conservative across the board, small c conservative. I don't mean politically, but they're slow to change. But they will go where the Imam is asking them to, because that is their mandate, and they will go where the Jamaat lets them go, right? And as many things as I think I can be critical about the institutions about, I think we also have to recognize that we are part of that community. In other words, they're not a separate Jamaat to our Jamaat. We are that same Jamaat. And so are we running to meet the Imam's guidance, and are we pushing the Jamaat, are we pushing our institutions one way while the Imam is pulling them in that same direction? Or are we pulling them in two different directions? And I think that for me is the question is, have I changed enough in this community to say, this is what I want to push the community to, and I'm building that community within the community to push us more broadly? So those would be the two ways I would answer that question about community shift.
Excellent. Um, Another great question that we have, who are contemporary Ismaili role models other than the Imam and his family?
My first role models were my family. I don't know who your role models are. So, Dr. Nal, I'm going to ask you to jump in on this one. But my first role models were my family, where I saw them serve, learn how to serve, and the Imam and the Jamaat to say, okay, we need to talk about domestic violence in the community. We need to talk about AIDS education in the community. This was within my family. This was in my friends. These were in my mentors. Our role models are the people around us at all times, right? And the Imam is always with us, right? The Imam's hand is always on our shoulders. And so that is a given. The Al Bayt are part of our history, but our immediate role models are our families, our mentors, our teachers, our peers. And what are we taking the best of out of it? So that would be my quick response. Dr. Nala, I would love to hear what you have to say about this.
So I am absolutely in line with you. I think my family was my foundation for um, as role models for seva, for being involved in Jamaat Khane. Uh, not as deep conversations as you were having regarding AIDS and more challenging topics that were taking place, but I saw my mom serving in Jamaat Khane as a volunteer every single day, and being, serving in what capacity she could, and that was inspirational to me. Having a community of people who just cared about you and treated you like family was extremely important to me. And inshallah, we're able to provide the youth of our Jamaat with the same sort of compassion that our, parents give to us as well. So role models are, an area that's really close to my heart. It's part of what I did my doctoral dissertation in. But parents are that foundation, and everything stems from that. So yeah, great question, and certainly on in line with you, Dr. Rashid, about that. Going back to the idea of community,
Mhm.
you mentioned being part of a beautiful, compassionate community that we should be in, and that happened for you in Aluma. What is the opposite situation that made you notice what is compassion? Uh, was it a feeling of belonging or the ethics that you were seeking that you didn't otherwise within the Jamaat kind
I appreciate this question and the attention to detail. Because I do want to be clear, and this is an opportunity for me to clarify something, which is always a wonderful opportunity. Um, as I mentioned, my family, my father, my mother, my masis, my masas, my mamu, were my nani. We were pioneer family. They were pioneer families here in New York, and they spent a lot of time in Jamaat Khana. And Jamaat Khana was our home. My friends, my extracurricular time was all spent in Jamaat Khana. But as a pioneer family, it also meant that it was work, right? It wasn't. It was the community, and you gave to the community. And I don't mean this in a way that I harbor any resentment. This is a very, very happy period of my life, but you were building something which you didn't necessarily see the benefits. By the time I was a teenager and got to Aluma, some other people were doing that work. And it gave the space to discover who you were as a person. In other words, you weren't, what's the expression, trying to build the plane while you were flying it, right? Which is what the early Jamaat kind of felt like, is that somebody else had built this structure. And I want to take a second when we think about role models, right? Those people who were at Aluma, the volunteers, every volunteer for me is a role model, and I don't mean just like the ITREB chair, who's a nice enough guy, he is. But also the people who vacuumed the Jamaat Khana, who opened the Jamaat Khana, who closed the Jamaat Khana, the people who sit behind path, right? Because they create the experience that allows us to engage with our iman, with our faith in a way that we need to, right? But to understand that we have that privilege, and are we taking advantage of it because somebody else is doing the physicality to make that space for us, right? And for me, Aluma was that space where somebody had enough compassion for the youth of the Jamaat to design this program, right? And not someone, but a whole bunch of people to design this program, to run this program, and to give us as teenagers that space to live and grow into what it meant for us to be Ismaili. but that happened because of their compassion. So when I talk about that beautiful, compassionate community that I experienced in Illuma, it's because somebody else was taking on that burden for me. And I don't know if they considered it a burden, but for me, having done that for so many years, it didn't give me that ability to see broadly. I could only see the trees. I couldn't see the forest. And this gave me the opportunity to see the forest because somebody else was looking at the trees. And so I think it's looking for those opportunities, creating those environments. And again, I'm just going to talk about youth because this is, I think, the context of my initial response is how we're creating the space for our youth to have these spaces of inquiry, to not be judged as they try to figure things out, to find the people that they're going to create the best sorts of trouble with, right? Because we need people who are going to say, this isn't working, and this is how we make it better, because complaining is not actually making it better. Find a problem and be willing to fix that problem, right? And that, to me, is that space. But that only happens when we have those dedicated volunteers who are creating that space for us in the first place, right? The material consideration for our spiritual development.
Absolutely. I think that's so correct. We do have a follow-up question that's very much in line. When we don't have access to that space, say we don't live within driving distance of Jamaat Khane, how do we foster, we as parents foster community for our Ismaili children?
I wish I had an easy answer. This is a reality that more and more Murids, at least in the United States, are facing. I think it depends on individual situations, right? Are there enough satellite families that you could plan a Chandrat gathering, for example? But I think, again, I'll speak a lot to my experience. And my parents were very comfortable in letting me go out and have non-Ismaili friends. And I remember going to churches and synagogue services with my friends. But then my parents, or my mother in particular, sitting down with me and talking me through what does this mean for us? How are we like, right? And having those conversations. So it's a reflective time to think about what does it mean for me to be Ismaili? And I think that is the space that I keep coming back to, but I think that we need to recognize and we need to generate is what does it mean for me to be Ismaili? Because if we're not encouraging a space, and I you know what, this isn't even for youth. I'm 48 years old and I'm still having this conversation with myself and other people and my friends, right? Is what does it mean for me to be Ismaili? If we don't have that community, if we don't have that space, if we don't have people we can converse with on this, then we turn to the internet. We turn to Sheikh Google and we say, Google, tell me what it means to be Ismaili, right? And we have people who will say, this is what the Imam means, right? And it's for me, that's very dangerous because only the Imam can say what the Imam means. I want us to cultivate spaces with how are you cultivating that relationship with the Imam? How are you thinking about what the Imam says and why are you thinking that? And how does that call you to action in the world, right? We talk a lot, we have very clear commandment in the Quran onwards, do not drink alcohol. And people are like, okay, don't drink alcohol. This is the absolute. And it is an absolute rule. I'm not saying we should say anything otherwise, but there's a very clear reason as well. Are we talking enough about reasons and rationale as to why we don't drink intoxicants? Because what is the gift that has been given to us is our gift of our aql. And every time we deny our aql, we're denying gratitude to God. We're denying one of God's gifts, right? And there are ways in which we can talk about this where if you're 5 years old, giving you the legal do not drink makes sense. If you're 15, you're ready for a different conversation. If you're 25, you're ready for a different conversation. But if we don't have that space of inquiry, and I'm going to keep coming back to that word, if we don't have that space of inquiry, if we don't have that space of ownership, of the ability to generate why I'm thankful to Allah, why I'm thankful to Imam Zaman, then we'll never be fully thankful because it's just something somebody told us. And for me, it's to this question of how do we generate that community is we are in a dangerous time of the internet being able to tell us things with certainty and certitude that were never meant to be said with certainty and certitude. And the internet is a space where we can create human connection, right? I have friends from when I was from my Aluma friends who I'm in constant internet contact with, Jamati friends all over the world, right? From various places I've lived. One of them texted me today, said, hey, your talk is going to be at 2 a.m. my time. Is it going to be recorded? Because I love you, but I don't love you that much. Okay, great. But, my friends, they have kids my kids' age. And if they, we talk about parenting and we talk about how do we do this. And my kids haven't hit it off with their kids, and that it is what it is. But are there ways you can create those virtual contacts with trusted other youth that your kids could create those communities? And so for me, it's thinking about what are the tools available to us, but what is the community that we want our kids to be in, and how do we create the space for them to figure it out on their own?
I think that's fabulous.
Sorry, but one last thing, Dr. Naaila, one thing. Whoever asked that question, if you ping us privately and let us know where you are, we will try to connect you with somebody, because that's part of what we're trying to do here is resource people.
Absolutely. So this idea of parents really being the gatekeepers to opportunities, especially when the community itself, the Jamati community, is not tangible, I think is extremely important, because our kids don't know where to go. They end up on Google, and uh, we've been talking about new artificial intelligence giving answers that are actually sounding very sophisticated and amazing, but may not have accurate information. And so parents having access to resources like critical conversations may then be able to take that information back to their kids and connect them with the other resources that may be available, um, especially with new programs. I believe there's one called Ask through the Jamati institutions now, where you can get in touch with a Vayazine and have a conversation about any questions that you have one-on-one. And that might be another helpful resource for kids to start exploring and learning more about what it means to be part of the community without necessarily physically being present all the time. So amazing, amazing things happening within our institutions. I do want to make sure that we get everyone out on time, as I'm sure some people, at least on the East Coast, may be wanting to get ready for Jamaat Khaneh. But thank you so much, Dr. Rashid. It was amazing speaking with you today. Thank you for the audience for joining the conversation. Hopefully this was just the start to one of many critical conversations that you guys will be attending and taking part in your own spaces. Dr. Rashid, would you like to add anything?
I just want to thank you, Dr. Naaila, for moderating this discussion, for the Farhan Husseini who invited me to do this session, and for the opportunity to serve, which is always a blessing to even be asked and then to actually participate. And thank you, of course, obviously, to all our participants who are here today, who are taking their time. And hopefully this is instigating everybody to think about their own relationship with Imam Zaman, because I would, as I said, I would be ashamed if you thought that I was speaking on behalf of the Imam. I am not. But hopefully this gives you some hooks to think about your own relationship with Imam Zaman.
Thank you. And again, today was such a treat to speak with you and have this amazing conversation. A couple announcements before we let you all go. In the chat, there are resources that you will find that Dr. Rashid mentioned. What Ismailis Believe series, I believe the link has been dropped in there. Justice and Remembrance, the introduction and spirituality of Imam Ali, and Spiritual Quest Reflections on Quranic Prayers according to the teachings of Imam Ali. For the recording of this critical conversation and past conversations, please do visit the Facets of Faith page on Ismaili USA. That will be dropped into the chat, I believe. And please look out for more opportunities and more info about these conversations that are taking place. The info can be found on the Ismaili USA website as well as social media pages for young adult conversations and critical conversations that are taking place this week and next week. And please do take the survey at the end of the session that will pop up on your screen. We love to hear your feedback and we take it into consideration as we plan future sessions. So thank you all, and Yali Madat.